Okay, this is a response video to one I think I can link in the description on this video in case you run across this video out of the blue and trying to figure out what this guy's talking about, right? But there's a video posted by a guy who goes by Hibernation in his own YouTube channel. Iraq War vet, lives somewhere in suburbia right now, and looks like a reasonably successful Catholic educated person who talks and gives a lot of advice from a military standpoint on should hit the fan, survival communities, that sort of thing. I'm unaware of what his experience is in developing any kind of cohesive or alternative communities in remote areas or anything like that. But I think what he's kind of getting toward is urban, suburban areas which have repurposed for survival, let's say after a long-term disaster or something like that. And one of the issues to bring up, especially when somebody's claiming the Catholic education pedigree and a Jesuit pedigree, is a issue of morality or moral authority to commit to certain policies. And I have to look at it from the standpoint that I'm having the moral authority to commit the advocacy of a no quarter policy is extremely dangerous ground to walk on. And that's regardless of somebody's background. Having the moral authority to commit to revenge killings, that sort of a thing, it can be a slippery slope. And it's difficult for me to judge it one way or the other without knowing or creating other circumstances in the scenario. And as we would create scenarios which can justify or not justify a certain course of action, we have to look at it from the standpoint that it's still an artificially created scenario. Some of us have dealt with some things like this in real life. And when we look at a situation where there's been an attack, and it's difficult to suppose everything in an attack, and whether somebody took a pot shot at somebody, whether somebody has actually attempted to overrun your community and really invade it and dominate it, or somebody was angry about something and was after an individual, or felt that they had some justification for their attack. We don't know. And it's kind of difficult to assign that to a scenario without having that as a predetermined point that we would discuss it from. And that gets us into a whole lot of other problems about a no quarter policy, because with a no quarter policy, you've decided to set that policy ahead of time. And my advocacy in these types of situations is that we would need to have people who are of good character and trustworthy to make a lot of those decisions on the fly, and then respect those decisions on the fly as those situations come up. And in those, that's where we have to constantly monitor what's going on in our own community in order to make sure that we're not on the unjust side of some of those decisions. And I'm not saying a winning side or losing side, I said the unjust side. And we have to look at that from a very real standpoint. And this is 2014, and since about 2005, we've seen a pretty broad increase in lethal violence on the part of law enforcement, for the most part, in this country. We've got cops killing more American civilians than Al Qaeda right now, and the body count's not shrinking. And we're not talking about in the course of a gunfight with gangbangers. I'm talking about even when we count premeditated murder, spouse homicide, a lot of those types of things. We're talking about a lot of homicides going on right now. The homicide rate is so high at this point that the FBI is no longer giving out straight statistics on it. They're not even giving us the solid statistics. We know that it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,200 a year. where the homicide was so bad that it resulted in a felony prosecution of some sort. And a lot of those were just straight up ambush killings. We're not even talking about where there was some ambiguity or question over an incident on the street. And when we look at that, we have to look at who is representing a community in that community's uniform as one element of why somebody on the outside or somebody who's supposedly an outlaw has decided to attack a community. If there's been a long string of injustices that were foisted on people, let's say, passing through, and those have gone beyond the point of what they would tolerate, they may choose to attack a community. And if it turns out that that community has just a no quarter, no mercy policy, only looking at the fact that they got attacked, and it's not the fact that they had made an area very unsafe to travel through, trade convoys being constantly ambushed, people waylaid and ambushed when they go there for business. Then we have to look at it from the standpoint of, let's say, for example, when the United States invaded Panama. A lot of people would claim that that was an unjustified invasion. But Panama had started to become an extremely unsafe place for Americans to live or travel. We look at other places in the world where they had become extremely unsafe for Americans to travel or try to do business in or something like that. And, we look at those now as places where drone attacks happen a lot. So it's not like I'm just some crazy, stupid individual who thinks unlike everybody else in the world, okay? You have to look at how actual nations deal with these types of things. And in a so-called without rule of law situation, there actually is no stoppage of the rule of law. It's just a question of whose law and who's enforcing it. And I can tell you, in my little corner of the world, it's my law and I enforce it. Okay, and I'll enforce it according to my moral code, and I will surround myself with people who have a similar moral code, and we will enforce that. And as the situation, as the recovery grows, we'll find other people of like mind who we will enforce our moral code wherever we choose to. And so when it looks at situations of communities or self-defined communities where robbery and mistreatment of others and all that kind of stuff is the norm, then we're going to look at the legitimacy of those and what their role would be in any sort of rebuilt, reestablished republic. And in that, it's going to be a question of their compatibility with the values and principles that established this country a couple hundred years ago, that it grew into at its apex and declined to after an extremely coordinated effort on the part of treason from within, and of course attacks and fourth generation warfare at various levels from the rest of the world, who, don't forget, rejected and kicked a lot of the people out who became our founding fathers, who became our founding citizens. Most of the people who really built and founded and have been the strength of America were people who were kicked out or exiled from the rest of the world. So if we look at America versus the world, maybe it's always been that way. And when we look at judging whether or not a particular conflict is a primal, savage, no quarter asked, none given type situation, that's going to be highly, highly situationally dependent. And it's the responsibility of people who are leaders in a particular community, and definitely leaders of any sort of conflict group, enforcement organization, militia, what have you, to go to the character of what they're doing. And I look at, let's say, General Sherman's march through the South, which was probably one of the most damaging acts of um, illegitimacy. I mean, it really delegitimized the victory of the North over the South at the end of the Civil War, and it made the South largely ungovernable for years because people knew there really wasn't a true moral authority on the part of the North, not after what General Sherman had done. And it took decades to repair that relationship I mean, I'd say that relationship wasn't fully repaired even into the 1960s and 70s, when in reality it probably could have been repaired much faster than that if they hadn't played so fucking nasty. And the military victory, I don't think, would have been remarkably different. The North would have won anyway. Uh, but they chose to play too fucking dirty. The Southerners knew it. And that delegitimized the Northern victory in those areas for decades, several decades. And there was a tremendous publicity campaign on the part of the Union for decades after the war, but people who knew what really happened knew what really happened. And so to advocate conflict at that level might be dooming future generations to not having a peace which would otherwise be attainable if more merciful means are used once you've consolidated a victory or have, let's say, dominated a particular tactical situation. And that's what Sun Tzu talks about in giving them kind of a way out, because as soon as somebody figures out, hey, wait, this is a no surrender situation, they're going to play differently, and it's going to play a lot harder. And not only is it going to play a lot harder, but what's going to happen is they're going to not really accept your surrender if you decide, okay, I guess they're going to have to be in charge for a while because they showed up with a lot of military force. And that's where you get into a cycle of revenge. It's not just a cycle of violence. It becomes a cycle of revenge and that sort of a thing. And that's where you get into that Balkans style stuff. And that's something that even if we have a breakdown situation, just as a lot of us who are students of Alex Jones might see how FEMA and various government organizations want to use a breakdown scenario as an excuse to take charge with martial law, I think there's a lot of other people who might be looking at it as an excuse just to go whole hog pirate. And do we make sure those people end up out of the gene pool? You know, to a degree, yes. But to another degree, I don't think we can make that a matter of public policy in recovery communities. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it works with establishing a long-term moral authority of a particular government to rule when that government by default is probably going to be an outgrowth of that community's defense group.